Ladies and gentlemen, your life is not controlled by your circumstances. It is controlled by your pattern of thinking. The way you speak to yourself in silence becomes the blueprint of your reality. Most people don't fail because they are incapable. They fail because they repeatedly entertain thoughts that weaken them. Thoughts like, I can't do this, I'm not good enough, it's too late for me, are not truths. They are conditioning, and conditioning can be changed. If your mind has been trained to focus on fear, doubt, and limitation, then you can train it again, just like a muscle. This is not magic. This is psychology, repetition, and identity shift. Ask yourself, who would I need to become for success to be inevitable in my life? Because success is not just about what you do. It is about who you believe you are. When you repeatedly feed your mind with empowering thoughts, your emotional state changes. When your emotional state changes, your actions change. And when your actions change, your life changes. But here's the truth most people avoid. Negative thoughts will not disappear on their own. You must interrupt them, challenge them, replace them. Not by ignoring reality, but by choosing a stronger interpretation of it. When failure happens, don't say, this proves I'm not enough. Say, this is feedback. This is information. This is part of my growth. That shift alone can transform a life. You are not your thoughts. You are the observer of your thoughts. And the moment you realize that, you gain power, the power to choose what stays and what gets rejected. Your brain will believe whatever you consistently tell it. So the question is, are you programming it for fear or for strength? Start today. Speak differently. Think differently. Move differently. Surround yourself with standards that pull you forward, not patterns that hold you back. Because the truth is simple. If you change your mind, you change your story. If you change your story, you change your identity. And if you change your identity, you change your entire life. So don't wait for motivation. Train your mind like your future depends on it, because it does. Thank you. Your life is shaped far more by your thoughts than by your actual circumstances. And this is something most people underestimate. Two individuals can go through almost the same situation, yet walk away with completely different outcomes simply because of how they interpreted it in their minds. One person sees a setback and assumes it is the end, while another sees it as a turning point. The external event is the same, but the internal dialogue creates two entirely different realities. This is the power of thought. It quietly builds the direction of your life long before your actions ever catch up. Every decision you make starts as a thought, even the ones you think are automatic. The truth is, nothing is truly automatic. It is just repeated thinking that has become familiar. The mind records patterns, and those patterns start shaping your expectations. If your thoughts are filled with doubt, hesitation, and fear, then your choices will naturally shrink. You will avoid risks, delay opportunities, and settle for less, not because life demanded it, but because your thinking trained you to believe it was safer that way. On the other hand, when your thinking shifts toward possibility, something subtle but powerful begins to change inside you. You start noticing opportunities you once ignored. You begin to see solutions where you previously saw problems. It is not that the world suddenly changed. It is that your mental filter changed. Thoughts act like a lens, and whatever lens you wear determines what kind of world you believe you are living in. A limited lens makes a limited life feel normal, while an expanded lens makes growth feel natural. Most people never realize how much inner conversation controls outer behavior. The mind is constantly talking, even when your mouth is silent. It tells you what you are capable of, what you should fear, and what you should avoid. If that inner voice is negative, it slowly becomes a prison you live inside without noticing. You don't need external chains when internal beliefs are already holding you back. This is why two people with the same talent can end up in completely different places in life. The strongest transformation begins when you start observing your thoughts instead of obeying them. Just because a thought appears in your mind does not mean it is true, and it certainly does not mean it deserves control over your actions. Thoughts are not commands, they are suggestions. When you understand this, you begin to separate your identity from your thinking. You stop saying, I am not good enough, and start recognizing, I am having the thought that I am not good enough, which immediately reduces its power over you. Once you fully accept that thoughts shape reality, you become more responsible for what you allow to grow in your mind. You start choosing what to repeat and what to reject. And slowly, your mental environment begins to shift. The same brain that once created doubt can be trained to create confidence. The same mind that once focused on failure can be redirected toward growth. Nothing about you needs to be destroyed, only retrained, because your entire life is already being shaped by the quality of your thinking in every single moment. Negative thoughts are not just random noise in your mind. They are patterns that your brain has learned through experience, repetition, and emotional memory. The more you allow a negative thought to repeat itself, the more familiar it becomes, and familiarity slowly starts to feel like truth. That is why people often believe their inner criticism without questioning it. It feels real, not because it is accurate, but because it has been played so many times that the mind recognizes it instantly and accepts it without resistance. What makes negative thinking so powerful is that it often disguises itself as protection. Your mind tries to convince you that worrying, doubting, or expecting the worst is keeping you safe. It says things like, don't try, you might fail, or stay here, it's safer. But in reality, this so-called protection becomes limitation. It keeps you inside a mental boundary that shrinks your potential. Instead of protecting you from pain, it often protects you from growth, opportunity, and transformation. The dangerous part is that most people don't even notice when negative thinking becomes their default state. It becomes the background music of their life. You wake up with it, you carry it through your day, and you fall asleep with it. Over time, it shapes your confidence, your decisions, and even your relationships. You stop aiming high, not because you lack ability, but because your mind has quietly lowered your expectations without your permission. But negative thoughts lose power the moment they are questioned. The mind is powerful, but it is not always truthful. A thought like, I will fail, is not a prediction, it is just a mental event. When you begin to challenge it, you break its authority. You can ask yourself, is this a fact or just fear talking? And in that moment, you create distance between yourself and the thought. That distance is where freedom begins. When you stop identifying with negative thoughts, something shifts inside your emotional state. Instead of being pulled down by every fearful idea, you start observing them like passing clouds. They appear, but they do not define your direction anymore. This change may feel small at first, but it is deeply powerful because it interrupts the automatic cycle of negativity. The mind begins to lose confidence in its own destructive patterns when it realizes they are no longer being accepted blindly. Over time, this process reshapes your entire inner world. The same mind that once repeated limitation can be trained to repeat strength, clarity, and possibility. You are not trying to eliminate thoughts completely because that is impossible. You are changing your relationship with them. And when that relationship changes, negative thinking no longer controls your actions. It simply becomes background noise that you no longer obey. Identity is the silent force that drives almost every decision you make, even when you are not aware of it. Before you act, before you speak, before you even try, there is a deep internal question running in the background. Is this something someone like me does? That question shapes your behavior more than motivation ever will. If you believe you are the kind of person who struggles, you will unconsciously find ways to reinforce that belief. If you believe you are someone who grows, learns, and improves, your actions will naturally begin to align with that identity. Most people think success comes from doing more, but in reality, lasting success comes from being more first. You can force actions for a short time through pressure or motivation, but if your identity does not match those actions, you eventually fall back to old patterns. It is like trying to wear a costume that does not fit you emotionally. For a while it works, but sooner or later, the discomfort pulls you back to what feels familiar. That is why identity always wins over effort in the long run. Your identity is built from repeated experiences, labels, and the stories you tell yourself about those experiences. Every failure you interpret as, I am not good enough, strengthens a weak identity. Every small win you ignore weakens your confidence in who you are becoming. But when you start reframing your story, even slightly, everything shifts. A mistake becomes, I am learning. A delay becomes, I am improving. These small shifts slowly rebuild the foundation of how you see yourself. What makes identity so powerful is that it operates below logic. You can know something is possible, but still not act on it if it doesn't match who you believe you are. That is why people stay stuck, even when they have information, opportunities, or talent. It is not knowledge they lack, it is permission from their own identity. Until you see yourself as the kind of person who deserves or can handle success, you will hesitate at the very moment action is required. When identity begins to change, behavior changes almost effortlessly. You no longer need constant motivation to do the right things because it feels natural. A disciplined identity does not argue with itself every morning. It simply moves. A confident identity does not overthink every step. It acts and adjusts. This shift removes internal resistance and replaces it with alignment, where your actions and your self-image start working together instead of against each other. The transformation happens when you stop asking, what do I want to achieve? And start asking, who do I need to become? That question forces your mind to think differently. It moves the focus from temporary goals to permanent change. And once your identity begins to evolve, your habits, your choices, and even your expectations from life start rising automatically because you are no longer trying to chase success. You are starting to embody it. Rewiring your mind is not about forcing yourself to become someone else overnight. It is about understanding that your brain is constantly adapting to whatever you repeatedly expose it to. Every thought you think, every emotion you feel, and every action you repeat is carving a pathway in your mind. At first, these pathways are weak, but with repetition, they become stronger until eventually they turn into habits. This means your current mindset is not fixed. It is simply the result of what you have practiced mentally for a long time. Think of your mind like a system that follows instructions, whether those instructions are empowering or destructive. If you repeatedly tell yourself that something is difficult, your brain starts preparing your body and emotions for difficulty. If you repeatedly tell yourself that something is possible, even if you are scared, your brain starts searching for ways to make it happen. The brain does not argue with repetition. It accepts it and builds around it. That is why your internal dialogue is more powerful than external advice. The real shift happens when you begin to consciously interrupt old mental patterns. At first, negative thoughts will still appear because they are familiar. But instead of letting them run freely, you start noticing them earlier. You catch yourself in the middle of doubt, fear, or overthinking, and you create a pause. That pause is small, but it is powerful because it is the moment where you stop being reactive and start becoming intentional with your thinking. Once you create that pause, you gain the ability to replace the old thought with a new direction. It is not about pretending everything is perfect, but about choosing a more useful perspective. Instead of saying, this will fail, you start asking, what can I learn from this? Instead of saying, I can't handle this, you start saying, I will figure this out step by step. These small internal replacements may look simple, but over time, they completely reshape your mental wiring. As you repeat this process, your mind starts to trust your new thinking patterns more than the old ones. The negative voice does not disappear instantly, but it becomes weaker because it is no longer being reinforced. At the same time, your new empowering thoughts become stronger because they are being practiced. This is how rewiring actually happens, not through one big change, but through consistent mental repetition that slowly overrides old programming. Eventually, your mind begins to support your growth instead of resisting it. What once felt like a battle inside your head becomes a smoother process where positive thinking feels more natural than negative thinking. You stop needing constant effort to stay focused or motivated because your mental environment has shifted. And in that shift, you realize that changing your life was never about fighting your mind, but about teaching it a new way to think. Most people think success is about waiting for the right moment, the right mood, or the perfect wave of motivation. But the truth is far more demanding and far more empowering. Success does not wait for feelings to align. It responds to action. The moment you understand that motivation is not a requirement but a result, everything begins to shift. You don't act because you feel ready. You act, and then your mind starts creating the feeling of readiness afterward. There is a powerful illusion that successful people are always motivated, always confident, and always certain. In reality, they have simply trained themselves to move even when their internal state is uncertain. They have learned to act in the presence of doubt instead of waiting for doubt to disappear. This is where most people break down. They expect clarity before movement, but clarity only comes through movement. Action is what produces confidence, not the other way around. Every time you delay action because you are waiting to feel better, you are actually training your mind to depend on emotions instead of discipline. And emotions are unpredictable. They rise and fall. They shift without warning. If your life depends on emotional stability, then your progress will always be unstable. But when you decide to act regardless of how you feel, you break that dependency and begin building a stronger internal structure based on choice rather than mood. What makes action so powerful is that it immediately interrupts overthinking. The mind cannot endlessly trap you in fear when your body is already moving. Overthinking thrives in stillness where imagination runs unchecked and creates worst-case scenarios. But the moment you take even a small step, you shift from imagination to reality. And reality is always more manageable than the exaggerated fears created in your head. As action continues, something unexpected begins to happen. Your confidence starts catching up with your behavior. At first, you may feel unsure, but as you repeat the action, your brain starts recognizing it as familiar. Familiarity reduces fear, and reduced fear creates confidence. This is why confidence is not something you wait for. It is something you build through repeated exposure to discomfort followed by survival. Eventually, action becomes your identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who hesitates and start seeing yourself as someone who moves forward despite uncertainty. That identity change is subtle but life-changing because now your default response is not, "Can I do this?" but "Let me try." And in that shift, you stop living inside the limitations of your emotions and start living inside the power of your decisions. The way you speak to yourself in your mind is one of the most powerful forces shaping your life, yet it is also the one most people ignore completely. Every internal sentence you repeat becomes a suggestion to your subconscious mind, and your subconscious does not argue, it absorbs. If you constantly tell yourself that things are difficult, your mind begins to prepare your body for struggle. If you repeatedly tell yourself that you are capable, even before you fully believe it, your mind starts adjusting your emotions and behavior to match that direction. Most people are far more careful with what they say to others than what they say to themselves, even though their inner dialogue has a much deeper impact. One harsh thought repeated daily can destroy confidence more than any external criticism ever could. The mind listens closely to repetition, not truth, which means even false beliefs can become powerful if they are repeated often enough. This is why self-talk is not just conversation, it is conditioning. The tone of your inner voice also matters just as much as the words. If your internal voice is always judgmental, critical, or impatient, your mind starts operating under pressure even when there is no real danger. This creates unnecessary stress, hesitation, and emotional fatigue. But when you begin to shift that inner tone into something more supportive and constructive, your mind starts feeling safer, and a safe mind performs better, thinks clearer, and acts more confidently. There is a moment in personal transformation when you realize that you are both the speaker and the listener of your thoughts. This awareness is powerful because it means you are not trapped inside your mind. You are interacting with it. Once you see this clearly, you begin to catch negative self-talk in real time. Instead of letting it pass unchecked, you start questioning it, challenging it, and slowly replacing it with something more empowering and realistic. As this practice continues, your mental environment begins to change. The same situations that once triggered anxiety or doubt start to lose their emotional weight because your inner response has changed. You are no longer reinforcing fear every time you think. You are gradually replacing it with direction, calmness, and clarity. Over time, your mind becomes less of an enemy and more of a tool that you actively guide rather than passively endure. Eventually, your self-talk becomes your internal foundation. It shapes how you respond to challenges, how you interpret setbacks, and how you define your own worth. When your inner voice starts supporting your growth instead of limiting it, your entire perception of life shifts. You stop being controlled by internal criticism and start being guided by internal encouragement. And that shift quietly changes everything about the way you show up in the world. Most people live as if their thoughts are private background noise, something that appears and disappears without consequence. But in reality, every thought is quietly shaping direction long before any visible action happens. The mind is constantly collecting experiences, emotions, and beliefs, then using them to create expectations about what will happen next. If those expectations are filled with limitation, hesitation, and fear, then even the smallest opportunities begin to look threatening instead of exciting. This is how a mind slowly builds invisible walls around a person's potential without them even noticing. What makes this even more powerful is that the brain does not naturally distinguish between repeated thoughts and actual reality. If you keep replaying failure in your imagination, your body starts responding as if it is already happening. Your emotions tighten, your confidence drops, and your actions become more cautious. On the other hand, when you repeatedly imagine possibility, growth, and success, your body starts aligning with those emotions too. This means your inner world is not separate from your outer performance. It is the preparation stage for it. There is a subtle but critical shift that happens when you begin to understand that your thoughts are not commands, but influences. A thought like, "This is too hard," is not a fact. It is a mental interpretation. Yet most people treat it as an instruction and immediately slow down, avoid effort, or give up. The real power lies in learning to pause that automatic response and ask whether the thought deserves authority. That single moment of questioning breaks the chain of unconscious behavior that keeps people stuck. As you become more aware of this internal process, you start noticing patterns you never saw before. You realize that certain thoughts appear not because they are true, but because they are familiar. Familiarity creates comfort, even when it is destructive. That is why people often repeat the same limiting beliefs for years without questioning them. The mind prefers what it knows over what it needs, even if what it knows is holding it back from growth. When you begin challenging these familiar thoughts, something uncomfortable but powerful starts to happen. At first, the mind resists change because it feels like losing control. Negative thinking may even intensify temporarily because it is trying to regain authority. But if you continue to observe rather than obey, the intensity begins to fade. You start creating space between yourself and your thoughts. And in that space, new ways of thinking slowly begin to take root. Eventually, this awareness transforms the entire relationship you have with your mind. Instead of being driven by automatic reactions, You start responding with intention. You stop treating every thought as truth and start treating it as information. And in that shift, your mind stops being a place where life happens to you and becomes a place where you actively shape how life is experienced, interpreted, and directed. Most people underestimate how deeply repetition controls their destiny, yet everything from your habits to your identity is built on what you repeat daily in your thoughts and actions. The mind does not change through sudden inspiration, it changes through repeated exposure. If you repeat doubt, you become someone who hesitates. If you repeat courage, even in small moments, you slowly become someone who moves forward despite fear. Over time, repetition becomes identity, and identity becomes lifestyle without you even noticing the transition. What makes repetition so powerful is that it bypasses logic and directly rewires emotional response. You might logically know that you are capable, but if your emotional memory is filled with repeated failure or hesitation, your behavior will still reflect uncertainty. The emotional brain responds to patterns, not arguments. That is why one powerful experience repeated many times can outweigh years of logical understanding. Your mind trusts what it has experienced repeatedly more than what it has been told once. Every time you repeat a thought, you are strengthening a mental pathway, making it easier for your mind to return to that same thought in the future. This is why negative thinking can feel automatic. It is not random, it is practiced. But the same principle works in your favor as well. If you begin repeating empowering thoughts, even when they feel uncomfortable or unnatural at first, you are literally building new mental roots that your mind will start following more easily over time. The turning point happens when you stop waiting for motivation and start respecting repetition as a tool of transformation. Motivation is inconsistent, but repetition is reliable. Even a small daily action, when repeated consistently, becomes more powerful than occasional bursts of intense effort. This is where most people fail. They rely on intensity instead of consistency. But intensity fades while repetition compounds silently and steadily builds real change. As repetition continues, something subtle begins to shift in your self-image. You no longer see yourself as someone trying to change. You start seeing yourself as someone who is already changing. That shift is not dramatic, but it is deeply influential. When your repeated actions and thoughts start aligning with a new direction, your mind begins to accept that direction as your new normal. And once something becomes normal in your mind, it becomes easier to sustain without resistance. Eventually, repetition stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like identity. What once required discipline becomes automatic behavior. You no longer have to fight old patterns as much because new ones have taken root through consistent practice. In that state, change is no longer a struggle. It becomes a natural outcome of what you have been quietly repeating every single day in your mind and your actions. One of the most powerful turning points in personal growth happens when you stop reacting emotionally to every thought that enters your mind and start observing it instead. Most people are completely merged with their thoughts, meaning if a negative idea appears, they instantly believe it and feel the emotional impact of it. But thoughts are not instructions, they are just mental events passing through awareness. The moment you begin to notice them instead of becoming them, you create distance, and that distance is where real control begins. At first, this awareness feels strange because the mind is used to being obeyed instantly. If it says you will fail, you automatically feel fear. If it says you are not enough, you immediately feel smaller. But when you start observing these thoughts as separate from yourself, something powerful shifts. You realize that the mind is not always reliable. It repeats fears, assumptions, and old memories as if they are predictions of the future. Once you see this pattern clearly, you start questioning its authority. This observation skill changes your emotional reactions over time. Instead of spiraling into negativity, you begin to pause and watch the thought rise and fall. It does not disappear instantly, but it loses its control over your behavior. You are no longer reacting blindly, You are choosing your response. That small pause between thought and reaction becomes the space where freedom exists because it allows you to decide what to do instead of being pushed by impulse. As this practice grows stronger, you begin to notice how much of your suffering was not caused by events themselves, but by your interpretation of those events. Two people can experience the same situation, yet one becomes anxious while the other becomes curious. The difference is not the situation. It is the mental interpretation layered on top of it. When you observe thoughts instead of absorbing them, you start separating facts from stories, and that separation reduces emotional intensity. Over time, this awareness becomes a new mental habit. Instead of automatically believing every thought, you start filtering them. You begin asking whether a thought is useful, accurate, or simply habitual noise. This questioning weakens negative thinking patterns because they are no longer being accepted without resistance. The mind starts to slow down, not because thoughts disappear, but because you are no longer feeding them with automatic belief. Eventually, observation transforms your entire internal world. You are still thinking, still feeling, still experiencing challenges, but your relationship with those experiences changes completely. You are no longer trapped inside your mind. You are the one watching it, guiding it, and responding intentionally. And in that shift, you stop being controlled by every passing thought and start living from a deeper sense of awareness that stays steady even when your mind does not. The moment you begin to take responsibility for your inner world, everything in your outer world starts to shift in ways you never expected. Most people spend their lives trying to control circumstances, other people, or timing. But the real control point has always been internal. The way you think, the way you interpret situations, and the way you respond emotionally determines the quality of every experience you have. When you realize this, you stop being a passenger in your life and start becoming the driver of your direction. Responsibility does not mean blaming yourself for everything. It means recognizing that your response is always within your control, even when the situation is not. Life will always present challenges, delays, and unexpected changes, but your interpretation of those events decides whether they become setbacks or stepping stones. Two people can face the same difficulty, yet one collapses while the other grows stronger, and the difference is not the event. It is the mindset taking ownership of response. When you stop blaming external factors for internal struggles, something powerful begins to develop emotional strength. Instead of saying, "This happened to me," you begin to ask, "What can I do with this?" That shift removes helplessness and replaces it with possibility. You start realizing that even in situations you did not choose, you still have the power to choose your attitude, your focus, and your next step forward. As this mindset develops, you begin to notice how often people give away their power without realizing it. They blame circumstances, people, or timing, and in doing so, they unknowingly accept a position of weakness. But the moment you accept responsibility for your response, you reclaim that power. You stop waiting for conditions to improve before you act, and instead start working with what is available right now, even if it is not perfect. Over time, this shift builds resilience. You become less emotionally dependent on external validation or approval because you are no longer outsourcing your sense of control. You start trusting your ability to handle situations rather than fearing them. Challenges no longer feel like threats to your identity, but like opportunities to prove your adaptability and strength in real time. Eventually, taking responsibility becomes a way of life rather than a decision you force yourself to make. You no longer look for excuses or external permission to move forward. Instead, you rely on your internal authority to decide your direction. And in that state, life feels less like something happening to you and more like something you are actively shaping with every thought, every response, and every choice you make. In the end, everything comes back to one simple truth: your life follows the direction of your mind. The thoughts you repeat, the identity you accept, and the meaning you assign to your experiences quietly build the reality you live in every day. Nothing changes outwardly until something shifts inwardly first, and that inner shift always begins with awareness and choice. You are not stuck with the thoughts you currently have, and you are not defined by the doubts that pass through your mind. What defines you is what you choose to believe, reinforce, and act upon repeatedly. The mind is not your enemy. It is your tool. And when you learn to guide it instead of obey it blindly, everything starts to open up. Success, growth, and confidence are not distant qualities reserved for a few people. They are the natural result of consistently training your thinking, your focus, and your responses. Every small mental shift you make today becomes the foundation of a stronger version of you tomorrow. So the real transformation is not about becoming someone else, but about returning control to the part of you that was always capable of growth, discipline, and clarity. When your mind is directed with intention, your life stops feeling random and starts becoming purposeful.